It was June 2014, and I was sitting in India, in Bombay, with admission letters to culinary schools in my hand from Manipal University, from IHM Kolkata, and these had come after sitting for entrance exams. These were proper culinary led programs, but I never used any of them. Not because I did not want to, but because most of these courses, specifically Manipal, for example, which was leading at that point, and people I was following and working with, like Thomas Zacharias and Shahzad, people I was working at that Bombay canteen one winter, they had been to these schools. But because the tuition fees for these universities, Manipal specifically, I can mention, at that point, so this is 12 years ago, was around, if I'm not wrong, between 250 to 300,000 Indian rupees, which you take 2 zeros off and you'll have the euro number, right? And that number doesn't even include what it actually takes to live away from home, to pay rent or share a room, commute to those places, come back from them once in a while to visit your family. And they even had, I remember, and specifically, it's very funny now that I look back, and that point it was, depressing and sad. But now when you look back, they all in perspective look so small and funny. And they even had this line which said something on the lines of, you need to have a laptop to be able to attend this program, or it's recommended to have a laptop with you. And at that point, that was something which was beyond my reach to get one. And at 20, I was, for people to know my reality, not trying to show it off, and you'll get why I'm sharing all these depth, is that I was living with my parents in a 1-bedroom apartment, one very small living room, toilet, bathroom, kitchen, and a bedroom shared by the 4 of us, me, my parents, and my younger brother. And that's where this letter landed, in a family where father was the only sole earner at that point. And you can imagine what the economies of a family like that can be, and the aspiration for someone to get into a field which does not really have a promise of high income to come out of it. It's not engineering or doctor or law. And that's the reality, or the room of context, where this letter landed in. So I did not go. And that decision is the whole reason I'm sitting here today doing what I do. I've had some of you message me after the episodes with Michael Barker, Adrian Woodhouse, that these are great episodes. First of all, to clarify, I stand by them. I'm very proud to have these perspectives of people like them who are heading the movement of the transformation of culinary education, the way it goes, into the podcast. But some of you said that it felt like the podcast is turning into an advertisement for culinary school, or getting softer, my stance on culinary school. And that's not what I want. And I want to correct that directly instead of just letting it sit here. I could conveniently let it sit and switch into the other typical episodes. But I said this episode is important. It is not a you don't need culinary school episode. That's not the argument I actually believe, and that's not the argument I want to push. But you will hear why in a minute. This is a specific story about specific things that became possible for me in my personal career, not because skipping culinary school is better, but because of the door I actually had in front of me and what I did with it. Back in India, to become a chef, the path everybody took was hotel management. The culinary schools at that point, the ones I mentioned in the beginning, were very new in the market. They had a more focused curriculum around culinary knowledge, but the typical path of the chefs you would see in the industry were people who had done hotel management. So if you look at the first people out of India to get Michelin stars in restaurants in London and New York, these were people who had gone through hotel management programs. And the reason for that is that because most of the good restaurants at that point existed inside hotels. So it made sense to study hotel management, because if you can just learn cooking, that's not enough to be a cook or a chef inside a hotel. So you need to understand other dynamics of the other departments of hotels. So the real question at 16 for me wasn't culinary school versus hotel management as some kind of preference. It was, what can I actually afford? Because I had both these options. I had 2 admission letters. One was towards culinary forward programs like Manipal, IHM Kolkata, but these were both private, very expensive, not accessible for me. What was reachable, even with a little hardship, to be very honest, was IHM Mumbai, the other catering college as people know it. It's a government-run, highly competitive exam that they have to get into it. There are 26 IHMs across India. Think of it as like a franchisee of colleges, and you need to get a really high rank if you want to be in Bombay, which was economically better for me, other than being the most famous or the best one in terms of people coming out of it. But it would have been way cheaper to study in the same city that I was. I got a very high rank in this competitive exam, and I got to this college. I want to be precise about something here because it matters. I did not choose IHM Mumbai over culinary school. I took the door that was open. If I had the money, I sometimes think, I would have probably gone the other way. So me saying that my path worked for me because I consciously chose the difficult road. It's not. It's the path I had, and I made the best that I could out of that path. And here's a part of the story that I don't get to tell in the flattering version. IHM Mumbai trained us the way they did. They had one day dedicated for cooking and one day on baking. And not even one day, honestly, it was 4 hours each. So two half a days in a week. And let's look at, for example, bakery, the bakery class we had around that time was the way the kitchen was, for example, to just make you picture it for those of you haven't been in those doors. We were trained to bake and to make cakes or whatever you could at that point on traditional Indian deck ovens. They were run by one dedicated person managing the temperature for the whole floor because a lot of classes were cooking at once. It was overlaps with different years of the degree who were there, which means I never actually learned temperature management myself. I never really learned how to dial the oven to the right temperature. There was no proper even a hand mixer, forget like Thermomix, PacoJet, KitchenAid and all of these things. But these things just were not there. It was a government run college, affordable, but with a very, very poor infrastructure. For somebody to go out of that and go into European kitchens was a real challenge that I had to face. The reality was that when I was interning in, say, Cordoba and Paris, I met students from CIA, from Basque Culinary Center, Ferrand de Paris, Le Cordon Bleu. I mean, name the schools. All the schools have their best students interning at these restaurants. And I would watch a sous chef, for example, tell them, go grab me the PacoJet or go program the oven to steam or bring me the whatever, the butterfly attachment or whatever these terms were. And they would just do it. I, on the other hand, had no idea what that equipment was. I had no idea what a PacoJet is. I had no idea how expensive a PacoJet can be if you don't set it the right way and if you fuck up the blades of it. So what we did have as a habit in India, we can call it jugaad, which is, how do you explain jugaad? It's basically finding a way to do the thing without the correct tool or the process to it. That cuts both ways. It's not a superior method. It's what you learn when the tool isn't there. And this happened to me, like these examples of, I would say the disadvantage is very clear, right? You walk into a room and you don't really know the common things that people expect you to know already. But the benefits, I would say, was that because of learning the science side of food and having a lot of, I would say, theoretical knowledge about food, and on my own part, like studying about it, watching videos, reading enough books, trying experiments in my home, in a home where we did not even have an oven, for example. It's not a classic tool in Indian houses, at least the Indian houses I knew in my economic strata, I would say. But I knew how to make a praline, for example. And in Mugaritz, when I was working there, we had an intern, I remember. She was from the Basque Culinary Center, to name names. And we had asked her to make a hazelnut praline. I think some other department, some section chef had asked her for that. Bad on their part for not guiding her through the process and just telling her to make it, expecting her she would know how to make that. And she came to me because she couldn't find her section head. And she asked me for, I think she said something like, do you have a wet grinder or a stone grinder, something like that? And I was like, what is that? And that was me 2 years into Mugaritz, which was like 4 years into being in Europe in one of the finest restaurants, the seventh best restaurant at that point when I was working. And because of them being at colleges, which are very privileged, and many of you out there, where you don't do the dishes, where you have all the equipments and whims and fancies you can want, you do learn about them, but it does program you to forget the basics of cooking. The basics of roasting a nut and ooze its oil, and you can put it in any sort of blender, or you caramelize it with sugar and then churn it into a praline. I think these basics were what I had learned, even though I was not practicing them. So that's also one highlight I thought I should share. And this focus of this episode being how did things happen during my career, where the choices that I made, not very consciously, but because of the limitations, made me the person I am today and gave me the career that I have today. Talking about benefits of not going to culinary school, I think there's another important part, which is like while I was cold emailing chefs, like Paco, for example, which is why like by fan emailing him, I sort of got this internship to do in Cordoba, my first place that I worked at outside India, talking my way into Pascal Barbeau's kitchen, standing 7 days outside restaurants in a freezing cold winter of January 2018 and convincing him to get me a spot and all the things that happened around it, which can't be shared here because of the amount of, let's say, gray area around that internship. I would say a lot of my colleagues who were then already almost a year out of hotel management school like me, they were still at management trainee programs, some of them failing management trainee programs or the interview while we were in college. So they were waiting a year to again reapply for them. They were sort of leading kitchen staff, but not really. I mean, if you had finished your management trainee program, what happens technically in India is You get to make menus and do some cooking, but you're very far from the flame. From what I know from industry colleagues and having done my time in Grand Hyatt in Bombay, I learned that all these management trainees at the end of the day are people who are, I would say, how can I respectfully call them? I think it's people who have a chef code and they wear it and they have chef to the name. But what they're good at, what the hotel sees they're good at, is managing, scheduling, making duty rosters, ordering inventory, using a computer, things like that. And that's what many of them were doing. And many of them, as a matter of fact, left the industry while I was doing these cold emailing and getting into internships and walking my way to the doors of Michelin-starred restaurants. They had left the industry. And I'm not saying this to talk down on them. That's not the purpose. There's no competition here. It's been 14 years to this period. The reason I'm sharing is because it's important for the listeners out there. What's genuinely the trade-off that path is that you're paying for the credential in the network. I'm sharing this to show the trade-off. The trade-off is if you go for expensive culinary schools, you are trading off time. You're giving them 3-4 years. You're paying for the credential. You're paying for hopefully a name that will open your doors. Hopefully a bunch of guest lectures from people that you aspire to be working with, or you've seen them chef's table, let's say. And sometimes that pays off a little differently than time on the line does. I just ended up years ahead on kitchen time because the credential wasn't the option for me in the first place. So because I did not have that option, I rather got into the kitchen and grew up the ranks because that was the only option available. And here's the thing, nobody in any of those hiring conversations, Mugaritz, Noma, Kraft Heinz, ever asked me. They never asked me, how many master's degrees do you have? What mattered to them was how could I operate for my recent position at Kraft Heinz, which is a senior innovation chef. So for them, it's irrespective. They gave me a case study about a real business problem before I joined the company. And they wanted to see a 40-minute presentation of how do I navigate that problem as a chef and a 20-minute question answer session on that. So that's the metrics they're judging on, which is why when I look back, I say, great that I did not do that, because I feel at 29 to be at a job where the average age is around the 40s, that's only possible because I went the path I went. What these companies judge for, or these jobs have judged me for, is whether I can operate, I can communicate, adapt, create value inside a system I didn't grow up in. Skipping that pipeline of culinary schools or that side of the approach to culinary world also meant that I never got boxed into something. I've watched that happen a lot to experienced chefs once they often enter corporate environments, where the intern becomes quietly a permanent label, no matter how much they've already proven, no matter what they've done outside the company, but because they've gone through a fancy culinary school program and they walk into these companies as interns, they have to somehow build legitimacy, break that intern box, which is very difficult. I've seen that happen in person. I've spoken to people interning at food companies, at R&D labs and restaurants. And they have a credential now, they have a degree, they have an internship, and they keep chasing something which would have been way easier if they had been honest to themselves of what they're looking for in their career, rather than thinking because somebody has done the path via culinary school or via a certain method by just copying it. In my case, I had to build my validation. I did not have a credential to me. I did not have something I've paid off which can say that, hey, this person deserves to be here. I had to earn that. I had to learn the organizational language by being in these rooms, treat my own experience as a credential, translate it however different my experience has been, like me working at Noma or me working in Mugaritz or spending time in a permaculture farm. All of that I have translated in a way that it becomes a valid case for my current employer, Kraft Heinz. And none of that could have been possible if my only validation is that, hey, I've been to this culinary school and hey, I know exactly the methods and principles of what your job is, which every other employee in your company already knows. And I've read a few books on that. And I want to say something that might undercut the whole episode a little, but it's the truth. If I had the money back then, I'm pretty sure I probably would have gone to culinary school. I looked at CIA at one point. I remember I was in JW Marriott Hotel in Bombay, and they had this open day for many culinary schools from outside the country. And at that point, the fees CIA was charging, I remember it was around 80 lakhs. How is that? 8 millions in rupees, 8 million rupees. And yeah, that was something I was very far from. And there was never a version of my life at that point where that was on the table. So here's a number I think about a lot though. My hotel management degrees, 3 years, cost roughly what some people today spend on a few months of a certain European gastronomy programs. I pay I think around 100,000 rupees. So that's, how much is that? 1,000 euros something a year. I commuted from home, so didn't have all of that staying cost and hostels, etc. And a decade later, my monthly salary is way higher than the whole three year degree what that cost, right? And to be very clear, I'm not saying this to brag, but I have a lot of you out there listening to this podcast, thinking and looking at these escapes from reality to see that I wish this was better. I wish I could have done this if I had this. I could have done this if I had that. But not really seeing the options you currently have. What is your reality where you are? What is honestly where you aspire to be? And what do you want your career to look like? And it's fine if that changes in 3 years, if it changes in 5 years. It doesn't have to be completely panned out, but build a plan towards that with your reality rather than wishing that you had this and that, or taking steps which you think are delaying that decision making. So this isn't that the pathless path is better. I heard this term on another podcast and I feel I relate with that a lot. The path that I took to get here is pretty pathless because there was no map to it. But I do not recommend anyone to try to copy my path, because I get a lot of Instagram messages from many of you listening to the podcast of like, hey, how did you get there? Or how did you get into that internship? Or how did you get that job? What do you recommend me to do? Honestly, I don't recommend. I stayed in this country, not in Netherlands, but in Spain, I stayed 2 years illegally. So I don't recommend anybody to do that. It's not a viable path today. It was in my reality when COVID struck and I had no way to go back to India. And I did not have intentions to go back to India because I had seen 1 year before going back what happened. And I stayed 7 years without seeing my parents. And because of having imposed on myself to say that I wouldn't go back, because if I go back and have stayed 2 years illegally, there's no way I'm coming back to Europe. And I carved my path to a certain extent where today I'm a permanent resident in Spain. And that helps make the path a little smoother now, but it's not been easy for sure. So how can I recommend somebody to do that? Because I took things day by day. As I said, COVID came in the middle of my career where things are finally starting to brighten up. So I had to improvise and change plans as I was running and hit the ground running when COVID phased out. What is possible is a lot of you out there can draw parallels to the things I did, writing cold emails, stringing together starters across 3 countries, going to doors of restaurants where they do not accept interns and convince them that you want to be there and you have to be there and they could not do this service without you. That you can draw parallel to and do similar versions of it, of what is out there for you today. Get something out of it, but don't mimic it step by step. Everyone's constraints are different. Everyone's realities are different. You have to forge your own version. What I'm glad about is something narrower. I had a real limitation. And instead of treating them as a deficit and complaining about them, I focused on what I actually could do with what I had. That's the only part of this that I would actually recommend to anyone listening. Fast forward to where I am today. Last year, I was in Japan on a project. I have helped build a gastronomic innovation campus in Tokyo. And I was there consulting food companies on how food innovation works, how food innovation has to work with the tech side of the companies. And this is what I was doing with many of these big tech companies in Japan. And in the middle of all that, I got a LinkedIn message from my current director of my department of consumer and culinary experience. And she offered me this role about a senior innovation chef. She knew me from LinkedIn. Again, a big reason to just double click on that LinkedIn is getting big in our industry. Whatever you're doing, however small that is, put it out there. And I do not mean that go on AI or Claude or connect some prompt. I don't know how agents work, or do something which doesn't sound like you. But sincerely, if you're doing something in your current job, I bet there are versions of it you can put out there. And the person on the other side might not know you exactly or might not know you have the perfect match for the job, but at least they'll have you in mind when they have this job coming up. So for me, that happened. Crystal, my director, wrote to me. I wasn't honestly looking to leave San Sebastian. I had finally built a home after that. As I said, I did not disconnect with India. So I'm becoming bigger. India today is somewhere where my family lives. It's not essentially home. And that, my parents could live in, say, I don't know, South Africa today. And that would, again, be somewhere I would visit because my family lives there. And San Sebastian had become home for me. I had built a life after that, a community, friends, connections, whatever home means to people. But at the same time, I was curious for this job that Crystal was offering. It would mean that I would work inside one of the largest food companies in the world right now. After consulting companies of similar caliber from the other side, working with Basque Culinary Center's innovation management, I had finally the opportunity to be inside these food companies. And combining that with the fact that my father would be retiring in the next few years, I support them for the past few years economically. I said, how much I love San Sebastian, I have to make this move because I would, kick myself if I would let this go away, because it was, let's say, many-fold increment from where I was working. And how reality of Spanish economy is, how salaries in Spain are. They're still better than, I don't want to sound bitchy, but it's still better than India. But again, Netherlands is a different ballgame altogether. And so my family's economic reality and my responsibilities combined with the exposure a company like Kraft Heinz could give me and the platform it could give me for my work, I said I could not, say no to this. It's a real Indian reality for many people out there. I think a lot of my listeners come from India or Indians living abroad. And I think you would connect with the fact that it's our society. It's a little reversed in that sense, because in Europe, I have friends and I sit with them and I see that a lot of them are supported by parents to buy their first car, their first house, things like that. But our realities, or at least the social strata I come from, is very different, where you become at some point very young responsible for your family's economic needs, and these economic needs get bigger as people get older in your family. It's a country with no real public health system like we have here in Europe, so there's no really public pension system unless you're working for the government. So these things started to weigh on the bigger side, and that's why the move happened. I don't regret taking the job. I do regret leaving San Sebastian. There's a whole life and community out there. I try to visit them as often as possible. But 6 months in this job, I'm the culinary lead in the European and Pacific markets of the Heinz ketchup, the iconic ketchup I grew up on, honestly. And working across both short-term and long-term innovation projects. I work on the short-term on the current status of tomato ketchup in European and Pacific developed markets, how the next 2-3 years are going to be for us as a company and what Culinary could add to that. But I also look at 10 to 15-year tech projects on things like, from what I can share, I would say, things like when people are starting to eat lesser fries and going through healthier habits, which is great. The company itself is changing its portfolio to become healthier in that sense. But what role does ketchup have in that new diet, where most of the ketchup is very high in sugar? So we have versions of it which are no sugar, and that, I mean, not to get into the details, but that's kind of the job I do for people who have heard the story now in the beginning of the podcast to know where I am today. And if I'm honest about what actually transfers from that hotel management degree, say 12 years ago, into this job, it's not the cooking. I mean, honestly, the ketchup is not a lot of cooking going on in that process, right? I mean, selling of it, yes, we have to create products where it could be convincing and appetizing for people to consume ketchup or different condiments, whatever that is. It's things like situation handling under pressure, working across departments, collaborating with people, understanding languages that people use, not language literally, but the language of like a corporate language, the language of marketing team, of packaging, their constraints, sensory science, all this collaboration with different departments, understanding priorities. I feel the hotel management degree, the kitchens I've worked at, have shaped mostly all of that. So understanding operations at a bigger scale than one line. That's something I got from hotels. And the intricacies of working on a line and how smaller operations, like somebody coming to dine at Noma, where I was part of 2 dishes on the 21-course menu for somebody paying 700-800 euros a night just for the meal. The leverage I have over there to be able to do R&D is very different compared to my reality today. So I feel hotel management gave me this scale to think of what needs to stay, what needs to fall when these decisions of scale come in. So there's a lot in there, but just to give you a gist, because this episode has been about telling you my journey and I can relate with how did that connect to my reality today. And now I want to zoom out for a second, because I don't think this really is a story about me. Yes, I've used my story to be able to draw parallels and to make this episode's core vision around my story. It becomes easier for you to relate or listen to examples of it. I think restaurants are good at one thing almost everywhere in the world: making progression visible. Commis to chef de partie, to sous chef, to head chef. Even in a bad kitchen, I would say you can see that ladder. The moment you look past the restaurant, the visibility disappears. Product development, innovation, sensory science, category management, all these things that I'm today in, these roles exist, but almost nobody explains how a chef actually gets there or which parts of kitchen experience even count. Restaurants train chefs, universities educate their own students, companies hire for a single function. Nobody actually owns the bridge between those systems. So people cross through it through luck, a cold email that happens to land, a message from the right person, a chance meeting that happens at a networking event. That's genuinely how I ended up at Mugaritz or Noma or Kraft Heinz today. And when the bridge only exists through luck and networks, visibility itself becomes a kind of privilege. And that can be very different where you are. For me, I realize now, living in Copenhagen, I had a much wider network in food, or in San Sebastian, a very different kind of food than, say, living in Bombay. And I mean, at this point also, I would love to hear anybody out there who's listening, because this is a solo episode, it gets a little lonely. I would love to see comments of people who are listening to this episode. Where are you listening from? Where in the world? Which city? Which country? Because it helps me to understand who's out there and what realities does my episode need to kind of resonate with. Just a very quick call to action: YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you are. Of course, like, follow, subscribe, and everything else, but please leave a comment of where are you listening from. coming back to when this bridge exists only through networks, the visibility becomes a kind of privilege, right? The people who already know someone find the doorway much faster. The people who don't often default to whatever feels safer and more structured. A degree, a program, something that promises a path even when it can't actually guarantee one. I actually had a version of this happen in one of my recent posts. I wrote this post about chefs don't need another degree. And somebody over there, I don't want to name, but maybe I'll try to put on the screen. If you're watching the video version, you'll see a comment where this person they called culinary school an expensive sense of direction and acknowledged it is what it is. And he said, like, some people need that structure to move, some people don't. I think that's true, but it also raises the question underneath it. Who gets access to that direction without paying for it, and who doesn't? That's the real answer to why I skipped culinary school, and a lot of people I know didn't. It's not that I made the smarter choice. That's no way what I'm trying to push to repeat once again. Is that the map basically does not exist. So people fill in the blank however they can afford to. I've written a lot of my Substack articles have been around this theme that the map where a chef can fit into today's food system does not exist. So for many of the people, this expensive sense of direction is what they need. And culinary school, if somebody can afford it, happens to become the path. So to sum up this episode, to whoever messaged me, thinking that the Michael Barker episode from CIA or Adrian Woodhouse coming from Otago in New Zealand meant I had changed my mind about culinary school, about all of this, is not. Culinary school is a real valid door, and it will stay. They are developing their courses, they're understanding the demand spaces, they're understanding the real problems with the way it's priced or with how outdated the curriculums are, and there's work happening on that. So it's nowhere to go. But at the same time, it just wasn't my door. This episode isn't a case against it. It's the specific list of things that became possible for me because I took the path which did not include a culinary school. And the argument, if there is one in this episode, isn't skip culinary school. It's work with what you've got, not what you wish you had. If this is you right now, figuring out a path with real constraints in the way, I'd love to hear your story. Message me on Instagram at Fugitive Chefs Podcast or at Furkan Mirza. I'm not the best to respond quickly, but I definitely respond. I have arranged one-to-one calls with people who have specific problems and I can help them with it. But the best way, I would say sincerely, not to promote the community, but the only way to, I would say, have a formal discussion with me and to discuss your problems in a public or private space is to be in the community. We have a lot of people navigating these problems. This pathless path is a little lonely because there's no manual or guidebook or handbook to it. But in a room full of people questioning these constraints, there's definitely a lot of answers. And I believe in a community can do much more than one can do just by themselves. I did it by myself, but I'm creating a resource which I wish existed when I was out there. If this one landed for you, if you like this episode, share it with someone who needs to hear it. It could be somebody from your culinary school, somebody who works with you on the line, because this could help them before they make a decision they think they can't afford. I'm Furkan, and this was Fugitive Chefs Podcast. See you in the next episode.